Okay, so hello, Alessandra, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about your fabulous new project, the Gothic Cookbook. I've been following it on Twitter, and it just sounds so awesome. I can't wait to hear more about it.
Thank you so much for having me on Harriet. No, we're very excited about this project. It's called A Gothic Cookbook, so I'll have to correct you a little bit there, but there's a story behind that because it may seem like a tiny detail, but we actually debated, I think for like a couple of weeks, also with Unbound, the publishers, about whether we should call it a Gothic Cookbook or the Gothic Cookbook. And we went for A in the end because the Gothic is all about air of mysteriousness and undefined reality. And so we like the idea of how an indefinite article kind of contributed to that. So that was what was behind our choice. So even from the title, we we were really thinking about how to structure this book. Also because it's the first book of its kind, so there isn't really another Gothic cookbook in the world yet. So we're very proud to be the first people to be working on this project.
Oh yeah, no, I love how much detail has gone into it, even the title. Yeah, absolutely love that. So my first question is, what was the inspiration behind this book, and also why now?
Mm. So I am actually in the process of finishing a PhD, and I'm doing research at the University of Westminster, and my PhD is on food and the Gothic and cultural memory. So it started as an offshoot to my studies in that sense, but also it was a very strange coincidence because on the day of my birthday, I received a package from my friend Ella, who is also the co-author with me of this book, and it had a really big volume of Edgar Allan Poe's Gothic stories, and it was so beautiful and big and black, and it had illustrations, and I said, oh, this is just wonderful. And she said, well, it kind of came as a second choice because I was looking for something else. I was looking for a book on the Gothic and food because I know that's what you're researching on, and there's just nothing out there. And I said, well, Ella, why don't we write something? So that's actually how it started, on my birthday, and that was like over a year ago now. And so it kind of, yes, that's the origin of it. So a combination of my studies plus this great idea that Ella had of sending me this book, which prompted this other idea of creating a Gothic cookbook. And so much at the moment is about food, isn't it? So it kind of comes at a time where we are preoccupied, particularly with food on many levels, even an environmental level, and the challenge of perhaps sourcing more organic food or healthier food or sustainable food. And so we're generally thinking more about consumption, I think, and to connect that back to the past and see how food has evolved from um, times gone by, and how that's reflected in novels is interesting, and how it's reflected in Gothic novels is particularly interesting because the Gothic is a genre which is all about fear and anxiety, and there's a lot of pressure now to look at food and our environment with anxiety because of climate change, and all the connections that that has with food. So that's why it's kind of coming together now, I think, and it's particularly relevant now.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Like, I love that it kind of speaks to these really big ideas and, like, big sort of political ideas, because it's the kind of thing that you'd kind of think, oh, food is quite an ordinary thing, but actually, like, it works in like some really important ways, especially in novels as well. Like, what are some of the kind of the really interesting things that food does in Gothic and horror that you've noticed along the way?
Yes, and it's also, the idea that there's more to food than what immediately meets the eye. So it raises questions like, what is the subtext? What is the message of the story? And as part of it in our everyday life, we're so connected to what we consume. Sometimes it can become quite difficult to detach ourselves and to look for meaning. But if we look in the earlier Gothic novels, there's hardly any mention of food at all. And then from the Industrial Revolution onwards, food becomes a more integral part, and it is a message, a signal of forms of discomfort. So yeah, that's really, it's noticing that arc and the development of food within those novels that's been quite interesting, to modern day Gothic, where obviously food is a big part of the story. And yeah, and just noting those differences and asking the question why, and what kind of symbols food offers that we can interpret our reality, because I think food is like part of our everyday can seem quite banal and quite, you know, an ordinary, even a bit, you know, it becomes a chore. So it's not so exciting. But really, when you look underneath the reality of what it means every day and who is doing the cooking and who is preparing the meals and why, and the feelings behind that, sometimes even not only in novels, but also in films, a real sense of horror can be evoked because food is so close to us and it's something that we actually take from the outside world and place inside our own bodies. So if we even think about that digestive process and that we're taking something which is external and placing it internally within ourselves and the transformation, then yeah, it can become quite eerie and weird.
Yeah, oh, it's just doing so many fascinating things. And I liked what you said about how kind of food is becoming exciting as well. Like I've definitely seen like a rise of that in like Gothic and horror more recently. I'm kind of thinking about like the Hannibal TV series and how they had like a food designer and everything. And like, even though it was like, you know, organs and guts and stuff, it was like, it looked amazing.
Yes.
So yeah, I think like we're kind of connecting with food differently now. And I guess also because of like programs like Bake Off and all of those kind of things, like it's just, it's become like, you know, it's less of a chore, it's exciting, it's a hobby, and
Yes.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's a way of expressing who we are. So also within the concept of food, there's a lot of hierarchy and questions and issues connected to social status. And we see that a lot in Rebecca, for example, by Daphne du Maurier. It's all about social status and the feelings that derive from that. So actually, that's one of the novels in a Gothic cookbook will be that we look at will be Rebecca. So there'll be an analysis of that and some recipes. So yeah, I should have said that in a Gothic cookbook there will be 13 novels that we look at, and each chapter will have 5 recipes taken or inspired um, from the novels. So yes, lots of opportunity to kind of feel what those characters were feeling while they were eating those things.
Yeah, and so many fab choices like Rebecca. I read for the first time only about this time last year, and I was just in awe of how brilliant it is. And I can't believe it took me so long to get round to it. It's so great.
I know, I remember reading it, you know, at different stages in my life actually, and it kind of meant different things, a little bit like Jane Eyre, which I'm rereading now. And I think the first time round when I read it, I was more focused on the romance aspects. Also, same with Rebecca, kind of the romance between the second Mrs. De Winter and Maxim, and in Jane Eyre, obviously between Jane and Mr. Rochester. And then, but reading it now under the kind of the eye with an eye on the food details, you can tell that things are not so linear and are not maybe not as romantic as they appeared to be the first time round. And that might be actually also because of the influence of other forms of media, for example, films that create more of a buzz around the romance and the relationships that there are in these books. But actually, the authors make it quite clear that that the relationship between the man and the woman isn't as flowery and nice as it's then portrayed in other forms of media. So it's quite interesting. And food is a big kind of symbol of that as well. So we can tell through food scenes actually that there are forms of yes of abuse nearly that take place, um, because obviously eating is such an intimate thing as well, and you kind of feel vulnerable at the table. And we can see there's a scene actually between Maxim and Rebecca where he's feeding her segments of tangerine, and yes, and it makes one feel quite uncomfortable actually. But perhaps the portrayal of this in the film isn't geared towards those feelings. So it's very interesting to note the differences as well.
Yeah. So do you find that in like film adaptations of these novels, there's still a big emphasis on food, or is it kind of just the original text that's doing that?
No, never as much as the original text, strangely. lot more food in the original novels, and then not as much really in the films. Yeah, which is interesting, or like a different type of portrayal. It doesn't have that menacing undercurrent, I find, which the novels have. Um, yeah, so that's also quite an interesting observation. Yes, I think recently, I think more and more films contain more food in kind of, and underlining the danger of food, but not so much before. No, this is
Mhm.
just something that's happening like in the last decade or so, I would say, where yes, the supernatural or horror is very much expressed by food.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Um, like observation about the last few years. Yeah.
Mm.
Um, so something I need to ask because we are a horror magazine is that do you
Yeah.
have a favorite horror film or gothic novel, and what kinds of works did you take inspiration from for the book?
Yes. So I do have many favorite horror films. I actually recently watched The Manor. I love horror films with older characters. I think they're fantastic. And like when the main character is a grandmother, this makes me so happy. It's how I would see myself in the future as well. So yes. It's just come out on Amazon Prime. I think it's Blumhouse film. So
Okay.
it's, yes, it's called The Manor. That kind of film where it's kind of action, but also witchcraft and supernatural, and plenty of food scenes as well. And the food scenes normally in this kind of horror are places where the characters congregate and have a little rest, but you always know that something is about to happen. Very often food is a signal for, okay, something bad, you're resting now, but beware, because this is just the beginning of something very, very sinister. And I love that because food is a way of relaxing, and it has become even more so in our day and age. We have a break, we have food, and so it's then that something bad's going to happen after that. So I love that idea, and how horror uses that. My favorite gothic novel, I would never be able to choose on one. I love so many. I love Beloved by Toni Morrison, especially though, and I love a writer called Mariana Enriquez who wrote The Things We Lost in the Fire. So some short stories. They are absolutely terrifying. And yes, so anything that's kind of borderline, makes you jump out of your skin, in the depth of night kind of feeling, which is so hard to get nowadays because we're so exposed to so much horror. So it's difficult to find a story that really scares you. And the novels that will be included in our Gothic cookbook are Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, Dracula, Rebecca, Woman in White, The Haunting of Hill House, Rosemary's Baby, The Bloody Chamber, Woman in Black, Beloved, and we're still deciding the last two or three. So we're still going to, because we're being crowdfunded, we still have some time. And actually, I wanted to say, if you wanted to maybe relay to your listeners that yes, we have a special discount code, and it's GothicPod10 for anyone who wants to pledge to make this project happen. So we're at 60% now at the moment. So they can go to unbound.com and look for a Gothic cookbook, and they'll find us there. And there are some sample chapters as well, and illustrations by Lee Henry, who's a wonderful illustrator. So I hope, yeah, some of your listeners or readers could perhaps help us as well.
Yes, absolutely. Go to that website, definitely, everybody. And that's such an amazing list of Gothic novels, like just some absolutely brilliant ones there. I loved what you were saying about food as being kind of like ominous, like it's sort of something that appears to be nice, but actually it's kind of like something bad's going to happen. Because actually, like now that you say it, I'm seeing that in kind of so many things, like even back to like, Snow White and stuff like that. Like it's always like the food is kind of like a threat that you don't know is a threat.
Yes,
Yeah. And
the
there's so many scenes
secrecy.
of
Yeah.
like characters, being presented with this like big elaborate meal, but like, oh, what's going to happen next kind of thing.
Yes, yes, exactly. And the idea of poison, and that we can't trust what we see, and we inherently trust what we see because we, as babies, we take the food that our mother gives us and our father gives us, and we trust that it won't contain poison. Obviously, we're always exposed to that possibility as we grow up more and more. And in films, I think they really play with that. And if you see in different types of like horror films, especially you see the non-traditional family, for example, a single parent family, you'll see that they kind of always tend to eat the same thing, which is also either a microwavable meal or perhaps a pizza, a delivery. So something which doesn't take much effort. And again, this is symptomatic of something bad which is about to happen, because a family that doesn't take time to cook their own meal, to chop their own vegetables, and to congregate in the center of the home, which is the kitchen, well, it's going to be more exposed to terrible things, obviously.
Yeah.
So you get a lot of like opening the fridge, closing the fridge, and that's when that terrible thing happens, you know. So because the kitchen is a site where we tend to like trust and have a nice time, because you go for snacks and you refresh and you look after yourself really by giving yourself nutritious food. But when it's not nutritious, well, that's a clear sign that you're in for something bad that's about to happen. And I find that very funny as well.
Yeah, kitchen horror is something I'm going to look out for now, definitely. I can imagine with this topic, it's the kind of thing that once you kind of start thinking about it, you see it absolutely everywhere, definitely.
You'll
Yeah.
never not see it now, sorry.
Yeah. No, it's great. I love it. So there's one question I do definitely want to ask you, and I'm sure loads of people want to know this, is have you tried any of the recipes, and are there any, particularly good ones, hidden gems?
Yes, we have. We've been trying them as we go along, as we're writing the chapters, we're seeing what works. And Ella Buchan, who is my co-author, is kind of the expert on the recipe development side. And so we've had a really great time kind of trying to interpret, because there isn't always kind of the description of the full meal. So we sometimes take inspiration. But for example, in Dracula, poor Jonathan Harker arrives, and actually on the first page he writes he writes a memo and he says, I must get this recipe for Mina, and he's referring to the paprikash dish. And Jonathan Harker is moving further and further away from the West, and he's going towards the East into these territories which belong to the former Ottoman Empire. And we see also how through the food that he experiences, things get more pungent and wilder. So we've tried to put that into the recipes that we make. Everything will be very tasty and traditional. There won't be anything gimmicky like,
Yeah.
I don't know, just things that you have in Halloweeny style food.
Yeah.
But it will be traditional. The traditional dish, and we'll look at how they would have made the paprikash at that time. So the idea that the spice is then what makes him have these weird dreams. So he doesn't know who to trust. He doesn't know if what he's experiencing is real or not real. And I think this is relayed really well through the food that he gets. And obviously the food contains more and more garlic, and he doesn't understand why. We know why,
Yeah.
but he doesn't. So we're following his journey as someone that doesn't really know what's going on, but we're following this through the food. So that's a good example of a recipe that we've been working on. And then, for example, in Jane Eyre, we tried the seed cake. There's this lovely scene where Jane gets told off in Lowood Institution, and the kids are punished actually because the porridge has been burnt, but Miss Temple, who's this kind teacher, gives them all cheese and bread. But anyway, afterwards, after Jane's been punished for something else unnecessarily, she invites Jane and her friend Helen Burns into her room and gives them this seed cake. And it's a very moving scene where she's obviously the only nice character in that school. And they really enjoy this meal, because throughout those early years that Jane Eyre experiences, there is hardly any food. And even when she has the opportunity to have food, she self-punishes herself by saying, no, I won't eat this. It's nearly like she can't believe that she can sit down and have something nice to eat. But she does in that instance with Miss Temple. And the seed cake is still a very simple recipe. And we've taken the original from Hannah Glass. And yeah, she obviously, the recipe, or that Hannah Glass's recipe, has 36 eggs, for example. So we won't be using, because there were no rising agents back then, so you wouldn't use 36 eggs nowadays. So we'll adapt it to make it for the kind of modern reader and person who can do it in their own kitchen without using so many eggs. Yeah, but again, it's really tasty, and yes. So that's another example of recipe that we've been working on recently.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. I just love listening to how the food is doing just so many different and really fantastic things in these novels. Like, it's anxiety, it's causing like delusions, it's comfort, it's just, oh, it's brilliant. I love it.
Thank you.
So were there any, because I can imagine that you were kind of looking at quite a lot of different recipes and foods. Were there any that kind of didn't make it in because it didn't work out well, or were there any that you kind of weren't sure about?
We're still working on it. We're having difficulty with Frankenstein because Frankenstein, well, the monster in Frankenstein goes foraging, and to kind of demonstrate that he's a lesser human, he's not really human. He wants to be subservient to Victor, and by showing that he is a lesser being, he decides not to eat meat. So there's this distinction between vegetarian and meat eating, which is really interesting in the book. And he forages for acorns and berries. And so we decided we'd make some recipes with acorn flour, but we're finding it quite difficult to source the acorn flour. So we did talk about, perhaps replacing it with something else, but we'll see how that works out. But that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. Sometimes we'd ideally like to include something exactly as it is in the book and use the exact ingredients, but actually the reality is that it can be quite difficult to source on a daily basis here, for example. Maybe more available, acorn flour probably more available, I don't know, perhaps in the States. I'm not entirely sure, but it is in the UK it's maybe difficult to find, so I have to rethink that. But we're still working on the recipes, so there'll be more.
Yeah. So you mentioned like with the Jane Eyre one, you had to make some adaptations or some changes from the original
Mm.
recipe. Have you had to do that with quite a lot of them?
Yes, we do that with quite a lot. We also have to use our imagination a little bit because, for instance, in Rebecca, there's the initial scene where Mrs. Van Hopper is eating the ravioli with the our unknown heroine, and yes, and there's sauce that dribbles on her chin. So obviously the ravioli traditional filling is with ricotta. We don't know what that sauce could have been, so we were just debating, shall we do a tomato sauce, or rather than the daube sauce, which is like a meat sauce that could have also been in vogue at that time. So we kind of do our historical research and settle on the best alternative possible that's also feasible for the people who want to cook the recipes here. But so that's another example, because it's not always described in detail what that food or that sauce is, especially in the Gothic. So often, and Dorian Gray is a particularly frustrating example of this, where he gets these trays laden with food, but he just says trays laden with food. There's no, and I'm thinking to myself, give me some more. Come on, tell me what's on these trays. And says sometimes, yes, the Oscar Wilde will say, well, it was a very thin slice of tea cake or something.
Yeah.
Not really, more, we need more. Yeah, so it can be frustrating.
Yeah, you'd think with Dorian Gray as well, it's such a wonderfully descriptive novel in some ways, but with the food, no,
What's in the food? Not
nothing.
too much. We'll have to let our imaginations take over a little bit more in that case, I think.
Yeah. So when you were kind of choosing these recipes, did you have a particular sort of criteria that you were looking for? Like how did the selection process work?
I think it started with each chapter having a loosely a different theme. So if it was, I don't know, The Woman in Black, it would probably be revenge. And what does that look like in terms of food? So how is that expressed through the food? And I think, for example, the main character there, before going into the marshes and that creepy house, experiences some really nice jolly times in an inn and a tavern. So you'll have like these large trestle tables, you'll be eating with farmers, and there's cheese and there's bread and there's beer and apple tarts, and so you get this kind of jolly atmosphere. Once he moves into the house, it's Eel Marsh House, there's kind of food, mentions of food kind of become quite scarce and they disappear. So it was about deciding, right, so how do we show that difference? How do we show this idea of revenge through food? Same with Frankenstein. How do we show this idea of self-punishment through food? So if the monster is saying that he's not worthy of living with other human beings and he's just eating vegetarian food because of that, or berries, or what he can find in the forest, in the woods, then how do we express that through the food? So by using this particular type of flour and making reference to the berries, and just things like that. And the same with Rebecca, you know, this sense of, well, she doesn't feel like she belongs to the aristocracy and to being the Lady of Manderley. So how do we show that through the food? So how do we choose the recipe to show that she is in some ways trapped in her reality and she can't get out and she's not really herself? So for example, I think we'll do the chicken in aspic there, because that gelatinous case that holds the chicken inside is quite a good metaphor for the second Mrs. De Winter. I think I called her Rebecca. That's such a nightmare, that book.
I know,
The
yeah.
second Mrs. De Winter feeling trapped in a situation where she can't get out, and Mrs. Danvers, you know, creeping up saying, why don't you just, you know, jump out of the window and then you'll be free, type of thing.
Yeah.
And then and that's kind of rendered through the food a lot. So that's, I think, how we went about it.
I love how the recipes and the way that they're kind of framed is like an extension of your analysis of the text. Like, I just think that's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, it's such a great approach.
Thank you. These 4 years at well, 3 actually, 3.5. Just, you know, the PhD has been a really great way of just like analyzing things slightly differently and through food, which hasn't been done that much before. So yeah, it was really exciting.
Yeah, definitely. You're breaking ground. It's great.
Will anyone be interested though, Harriet? This is
yes,
the thing.
Absolutely. So what was some of the most fun parts of the project, and were there any particular challenges that you found, like you said, you know, adapting some of the recipes? Were there any other challenges or
Yes.
particularly fun parts of it?
Yeah, other challenges, it's been challenging, you know, the crowdfunding aspect, because this is an original project, and we're a team of 3. So as I said, Ella Buchan is my co-writer, and then we have Lee Henry, who is the illustrator, and then myself. And we wanted to stick together, get this project done how we envisioned it could work. And so going to a traditional publisher, we got some responses along the lines of, well, if this hasn't done before, then most likely it's because there isn't really a market for it. So when we approached Unbound, I mean, they responded the next day with enthusiasm. So we were so happy, and they're so brilliant. But the fact that you're crowdfunding it yourself and having to create content every day to entice people to making pledges, obviously, it can be challenging and tiring, but it's been working really well so far. And as I said, we're at 60%, so we're hoping that with a bit more exposure, we still get lots of people writing messages saying, oh, we had no idea that this was happening. And I think, oh, we're on Twitter every day trying to post on Instagram, how can you not know? But no, so we're still trying to get out there and reach as many people as possible who could be interested in it. Yes, and also dismantling this idea of food in the Gothic and in horror as being something gimmicky and disgusting, because, you know, you get films like Drag Me to Hell, for example, and you have the eye in the soup, the tooth in the cake, the, you know, the worms, so people, the natural association between horror and food, or Gothic and food, is one which isn't particularly enticing. So we're trying to also just put out there that our recipes are doable in a way that they will also be edible and and tasty. So
Yeah, definitely. I think that's so important, because when you think of Gothic food or food in horror, you probably think of, like, you know, slime soup and eyeballs and blood and guts and stuff. But actually, it could just be normal food, but it's food that has like a really important purpose in, like, the text. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's just looking at food in a different way, as you said, like, also, you know, different layers of meaning, but not necessarily that bring forward a sense of disgust. It's just like a different way of looking at a situation. You realize it's actually sending out like a different a different message connected to the main plots and obviously to the characters, but it's telling a little side story, which is a more of an insight into what the character's going through, perhaps.
Yeah. So you mentioned your designer Lee Henry. So on your website, there's a few little snippets of the
Yeah.
illustrations, and they're so cool. So yeah, I kind of wanted to ask, like, what did you want to kind of go for with the designs, and what kind of tone did you want to create with those?
Yes, so we initially wanted to make it a book where all our illustrations were in full color, and then actually Unbound suggested that we stick to 2 colors. So yes, we discussed it with Lee, obviously, and we went for red and black because I guess in every story there is, you know, some reference to, I don't know, blood, or some food can be rendered in red rather than any other color. And Lee's been working with that, with what I thought would be initially a challenge for him, but actually he's absolutely wonderful and so talented, and he's made it work so well with different shades. It's the same shade of red, but just how he actually incorporates it in the design of the illustration makes it seem different. So it's really wonderful, and he has such a great imagination and creativity. So for Rebecca, he designed a big teapot, and then the kind of steam that comes out of it is also the winding road that leads towards Manderley. And it's just like, it's really beautiful. And obviously the Dracula illustration. So, and there's still so much more to do, but we have some time still.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the 2 colors really works. Like, when I first saw them, I kind of thought, like, this is really like stylish and distinct and unique. Like, I think it really works. As opposed to using like the full color, it's like you've got a kind of like unique look to the whole
Yes,
book.
it seemed like a limitation at first, but actually I think it could work even better. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So one final question for me, just because we're wrapping up. So what can we see from you in the project next? And is there anything you'd like to plug?
Not at the moment, because we're crowdfunding. We're actually in the process of finishing this, so we haven't thought ahead. But who knows? Because there's so much to explore with food that it's really hard to not think of so many more ideas. And I think, especially on the recipe development side, and for Ella, like she would probably, yes, be interested in taking it forward in a direction which has to do with, yes, perhaps organizing supper clubs, or we could do talks together and introduce more and more people to this weird combination of food and the Gothic if they're interested. Yeah, it would be great to do that.
Oh yeah, that would be brilliant. Yeah, like a talk at an afternoon tea or something with like themed
We could tour the
yeah.
we could tour the UK. Instead of music, we'd be like, here's dressed as Mrs. Danvers and Rebecca, or the second Mrs. De Winter, offering tea and explaining how food works in the Gothic. This is a dream. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, please do that. It's immersive.
But yeah. A virtual Gothic reality coming to life now.
Well, Alessandra, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I've absolutely loved hearing about the book, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And the book is nearly published as well, 60%. That's great. And yeah, I really look forward to seeing the book coming out.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's been an absolute pleasure.